a modern view of Hook Norton, but in this film we hope to show you scenes of the village and some of its inhabitants between about 1890 and the middle of this century. We start with an early view of the Norman church, showing no steps and the high churchyard wall, which was lowered and set back in 1960, the cause of much concern at the time. The earliest fairs and markets were held in the churchyard, and later in the square. Scaffolding around the tower in 1913, when the original clock face was raised, 2 more were added and a good deal of work done to the tower. The old school and the church, showing the new clock face on the west side. The niche below was probably occupied by a statue of St. Peter and removed by the reformers in the 17th century. In the chancel we see the curtains either side of the altar, which were given by Mr. Bull, the vet, on the occasion of his daughter's wedding. The Reverend Beardshaw, rector from 1924 to 1932, had them removed. Looking to the south side, we see rows of pews on the site of the present altar, which was installed after the Second World War. The brass plaques on either side record the names of the 33 men from the village who were killed in the First World War, and 6 between 1939 and 1945. The 8 bells were also recast and rehung in memory of all who had served from the village. In March 1882, a stained glass east window was installed in memory of John Richard Rushton, rector of Hook Norton for 40 years, from 1841 to 1881. In March 1883, a new pulpit was installed. This is a more recent view in the church and shows the screen which was erected by the Reverend Nind, who was rector for 23 years, from 1932 to 1955. A fine example of a Norman tub font. In August 1880, there was a Sunday school outing to Swerford Park, for which 5 farmers provided horse-drawn wagons for transport. The Reverend Freeman and Dolby Phipps, who followed his father as sexton, an office that they held between them for 79 years. The Miss Dickens played a very active part in the village and church life. Their names are inscribed on the treble and second bell as a tribute to their memory. Barbara died in 1943 and Margaret in 1947. The Reverend Freeman and the choir have their photo taken outside the tower entrance in 1910. Among those in the choir are George Sabin, Alfred Borsberry, Nelson Bowler, William Sweetman, William Bloxham, Harold Whiten, Reginald Bowler and Fred Whiten. The church choir entered the Bucks and Oxen Choir competition and were winners several consecutive years in the 1930s. The Reverend Nind stands on the far left, and Frank Whiten, third from the left, who was sexton for 67 years. Miss Margaret and Miss Barbara Dickens are seated in the centre, and the small boy in front of them with the shield is Albert White. The Reverend and Mrs. Nind started a mothers' union on December the 15th, 1937, which lasted until 1971. Opposite the church is the square and Reeves House, dated 1775. F. W. Phipps had a butcher's shop here for 40 years. The house had a front door opening onto the highway then, and the house just above was known as Bell Inn and owned by the Colgraves at this time. The F. W. Phipps butcher's delivery van with Sidney Whiten. Coronation Day celebrations for George VI on May the 12th, 1937. The road by the square completely blocked by spectators. Maypole dancing in front of the Sun and Red Lion. The Red Lion was selling celebrated Brackley ales and stout, while the Sun sold Hook Norton ales and stout, and also advertised good stabling. A last century scene when farm stock sales were being held in the High Street. Another early view of High Street. The first shop on the right, here called the Bazaar, was a milliner's, kept by Francis and Eva Cook in 1895. Shortly afterwards, Turnocks took over, followed by Gaddis in 1939. Mary Ann Moulder was a dressmaker and lived in the next house with the tailor's window near the roof. The shop on this side of Queen Street was said to have been the Rose and Crown public house early last century. In 1854, G. Brewer was a tailor and draper here, followed by John Frederick Spatcher, who was a grocer. Around 1908, Mr. and Mrs. F. Busby opened up a butcher's shop here, and the same business was carried on by Ralph White around 1920, and later Messrs. Butler, Marley, Hodges and Horn. There were 3 butchers in the village early this century. A Christmas display in Mr. Busby's day. Unfortunately, he was killed in the First World War. Ralph White, who succeeded him, is on the right holding a poleaxe. Next, this side is Dial House, with its square sundial above the door. Alban Bull, a veterinary surgeon, lived here in 1871, and Barclays Bank had a branch here in 1931. On the right, the shop of Spatcher's Grocery, before the butcher's shop. The one on the other side of Queen Street was Osborne's, the tailors, from 1887 to 1914. Mrs. Spatcher then took it over, with the post office and general stores. Next to the churchyard we see Hyatt's shop, hatters, drapers, outfitters, etc., probably around 1910. Reuben Green took over this shop later. Around 1923, an experimental monolastic road surface was being laid from Scotland End to Milcombe. The material was brought by rail to the Brimbo site, where it was prepared for use. The band leading a parade up High Street, with Magdalen Lodge on the right, and the dwelling on the left that adjoins Priestfield was the first post office, kept by Fanny Harris from 1872 till it moved to the corner of Queen Street in 1914. It had been open from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekdays and 8 till 10 a.m. on Sundays. Looking down High Street, we see a horse-drawn passenger vehicle and a steam traction engine at the entrance to Bell's Chure. On the extreme right, we see part of the old dungeon or lockup, the old fire pump, and the oil street lamps have been housed here. On the end of the house behind was the AA sign, Banbury 9 miles and Chipping Norton 7. The Turnock stores with their horse-drawn delivery van. The bay window recently installed at a cost of £100. They had the first bus in the village, a Ford Model T in 1921, and the first petrol pumps. Next door is the Bell Inn, which was kept by Henry Turnock at this time. Many public events took place here. In 1858, the United Providence Society had a parade to the church, led by Bloxham Band, and followed by a dinner at the Bell. The petrol pumps can just be seen here by the shop, with delivery pipes reaching out to the roadside. Gaddis owned the shop at this time, and the vehicle by the triangle is probably their taxi. We now see 5 motor vehicles in High Street. The railings by the footpath had not long been erected, and the concrete edge to the new road surface is noticeable. Outside their home, at the bottom of Queen Street, we see Will Fairbrother, Mrs. Fairbrother, and Mrs. Grimmett. There is an old saying that there was a tunnel from this dwelling to the church. The three dwellings behind Borsberry's blacksmith shop. The Borsberry family lived in the nearest. Daisy Haynes had a sweet shop in the middle one, and Dolby Phipps, a clock mender and barber, was in the lower one. The thatch was removed from these dwellings around 1947. Spectators on the bank in front of these last houses, watching the flower show procession in High Street in 1923. On the lower side of High Street and on the corner of Bell Hill were Henry and Thomas Borsberry, who were shoemakers, saddlers and harness makers from 1869 to the end of the last century. Next along, seen here, was W.H. Heritage, another saddler and harness maker in the 1930s. He later moved his business to East End. General shopkeepers followed in this area, the latest being Mr. and Mrs. Manning, who converted their shop back to a dwelling in 1984. Here, the Saddler's is a general store, with a similar one to the right. On the left, we see a car and a petrol pump just outside Manning's shop, and a bus in the square. The fire brigade lead the procession for the celebration of the coronation of George V in 1910. Fancy dress contestants among the parade passing through the High Street for the flower show in 1923. Wisteria House, the home of the Allens, followed by the Painters, who farmed land in the South Hill area. Barclays Bank had a room here at this time. Their plate is on the left of the front door. Next to the bell was the Banbury Cooperative Industrial Society shop. Standing outside, left to right, are Billy Horn, Mr. Robbins the manager, and Bill Croft. In 1871, John Lee Borton, a farmer and butcher, kept a shop here. In the early 1970s, it was converted to two dwellings. One of the horse-drawn delivery vans, which were taking bread and grocery over a wide area at the beginning of this century. Fred Coleman is standing by the horse. Just above the entrance to the rectory and the road to Down End was Coleman's General Stores, who killed and cured their own pig meat. They sold groceries and almost everything that the villagers were likely to need. They were later taken over by Pillsworths. But before Coleman's, F.W. French was a grocer and farmer here in the 1870s. From the other end of High Street, we look back to the church tower, before the extra clock faces were added in 1913. The old school was built in 1875, with the schoolhouse adjoining this side of it. Mrs. Mobley, a well-known carrier, was living in the schoolhouse in the 1950s and 60s and was a school caretaker. She died in 1966. Samuel Timms was a baker in the house on the left in 1907 and later carried on his business in the house opposite the Memorial Hall.
Right, finishes at...
From the church tower we see Bell Hill cottages, which have a date stone of 1752 with the letter G over BWG. Francis Neva Cook were milliners in the top cottage, and boot and shoe repairs were carried out in the bottom one. The allotments this side of Park Hill are in the background. The square and the blacksmith shop on the left. The Borsberrys were here in 1887 and S. Borsberry and Sons until 1940. A fire in the club room behind the Lion in 1945 also set fire to two thatched cottages adjoining, which we can see here. In the 1950s, a garage with a flat roof was built on the site. A view towards the Green and East End. The thatched cottage at the end of the Green was burnt down in 1929. The wilderness allotments are on the right. An old view into Southrop and the village, taken from the top of the viaduct. The thatched cottage that adjoined the wheat sheaf can just be seen, and the windows in the roof of Southrop farmhouse and the cottages in Ashburton Lane. An early tower view looking into the shearing close, which was church property until 1774. Behind are the first council houses, built from stone that was dug on the site and costing £1,100 each. Note the tall fir tree at the entrance. Originally there was also a 5-bar gate here. Here we see the workers who were building the council houses in 1921. Looking down to the top of Queen Street, previously Garrett's Lane, it is odd to think that in 1935 the parish council were considering closing this lane to all through traffic. The Westons were blacksmiths on the left here till the 1950s. Talbot House, next to the lane, was a Talbot Inn in the 18th and 19th centuries. Laburnum House, on the opposite side, is dated 1679. The Busby family lived here and were builders, painters and decorators. Looking into Southrop, first mentioned in 1316. In the 18th century there was a constable for the north side of the Rop stream and one for the south, and neither could take action in the other's area. There were tan pits on the corner of Park Lane. The building there now has a flat roof, and the thatch on the roof up Brick Hill has been removed. Joe Dumbleton lived up Brick Hill. He was a pig killer and a town crier early this century. Looking down towards the paddocks, known for an extensive and beautiful garden, and used by the village for numerous social events. The house was built in 1836 on the site of a previous one. Note the hand pump in the school playground. The late John Hands in the Paddocks yard. A view from Swerford Road showing the wheat sheaf with its adjoining thatch cottage and Beanacre Cottage on Cross Bank, which was used as an overspill area for various celebrations in the village. The site of a village pound on the opposite corner, and to the far left was the Quaker meeting house, built in 1705. It was being used for evacuees as well as meetings in the Second World War, and demolished in 1953. There was no Quaker burial ground, the one at Sibford Gower being used. The Baptist chapel, built in 1871 on the site of a previous one. The first Baptist congregation was formed in 1640, and in 1728 Hook Norton was a centre for 22 surrounding villages, Stow-on-the-Wold being one of the most distant. The Baptist schoolroom was built on the site of cottages in 1873. The interior of the chapel, early this century, with its tortoise stove and oil lamps. On July the 21st, 1872, the Baptist Sunday School went to Edge Hill for a picnic. Just below the schoolroom, on the left here, is the Baptist manse, built in 1871. At one time there was an open-air baptistry behind the manse. There were 2 thatch cottages on the left by the horse rider, and lived in by the gardeners, both thatchers. Francis Veal's sweet shop is on the opposite side of the road. Opposite the manor we see Harry Gardner with his champion Golden Bennett racer. Standing well back from the railings are the 2 dwellings built around 1895. One of these was a police house before the County Council built a new one around 1970 on their land in the Bourne. This is a last century picture of Bray's saddler's shop, which appears to be standing in the gardens of the 2 dwellings just mentioned, and could well have been taken before 1895. This is a close-up of the board above the saddler's window. Looking down Netting Street towards the village, in the last house before Watery Lane E. Haynes was a baker, and behind it there have been 3 butchers in this century, Messrs. Stanley, Eagles and Dumbleton. Still looking in the same direction, we see the plot of land long before being built on. Also the long thatched cottage and barn. George Archer ran the first taxi service from this cottage. The manor has no front garden, and this is a view of the house from the large and beautiful garden at the back. The house has the date of 1636 with the letters R.A., and it belonged to the Austin family in the 17th century. Another picture of Hook Norton's champion cyclist with a group of admirers. Hook Norton teenagers in the hut that was built in 1953 for the Air Training Corps. It stands on the 1-acre rickyard which, with Stapen Hill House below, once belonged to the manor opposite. These are some of the 25 members of 2207 Squadron, in whom Dr. Agnew of Sibford, who had a pilot's licence, took a great interest. The hut was also used by the band and the Young Farmers Club. The original rent for the site on which it stands was £2 per annum. At Scotland End we see the grass triangle with the signpost, the oil lamp and the heap of stone for road mending, and the tall elm trees behind. The Pear Tree, a Hook Norton brewery house since 1869, with a Bedford brewery lorry outside, probably in the late 1930s. The oil lamp, the Chipping Norton Road, and the cottage by the pear tree that had its thatch removed in 1939. The small barn that stood at the bottom of Brewery Lane. Above Round Close is Mary Mount, said to have been the Crown Inn. It has a cellar the length of the house, and had hooks on an outer wall that could have been used for tying up horses. Above is Scotland Mount, the home of Mr. Newton, a hay dealer in the 1920s. The Heathrop Hounds meet outside the pear tree in 1932. Bungalows were built on land on the left in 1968 at a cost of £7,000 each. The bridge on the corner was built in 1820. Prior to that there was a ford here and what was known as Washbrook Ditch. Around the corner was Austin Hall's wheelwright's cottage. He was also a well sinker. There were 137 wells in Hook Norton at one time. This house was occupied by several generations of the Hall family, going back to at least 1774. They had the upper story added in 1888. The late Francis Smith, née Hall, can just be seen at the garden gate in the 1920s. A 1904 view showing the wheelwright's cottage on the extreme left, Harwood farmhouse in the centre, and Brooklyn farmhouse on the right. The brewery, which was started in the 1850s by the Harris family. This is the new Tower brewery that stands on the site of the previous one. It was built in stages around the end of the last century, and production continued during the rebuilding. The Thornley steam engine, now oil-fired, pumped water to the top of the building. The large stable buildings behind were being rebuilt around 1904. A large number of workmen during the rebuilding. The front near completion, but a large part at the back still not started. Some of the brewery employees early this century, when there were about 24 on the production line and 15 draymen. In the earlier part of this century, beer was being sent by rail to the more distant customers, such as working men's clubs in Coventry. Office staff early this century. Front row, Frank Veal, Harold Whiten, Ernie Robbins and George Groves. Middle row, Messrs. Drake, Walker and Allen. And at the back, Mr. Stratford. During the wars, supplies were very limited. An early view of spectators in their best hats at the flower show in the shearing close. At the end of the last century, the shearing close was being considered for a cemetery. Swings and roundabouts in 1908. At the 1912 flower show and the start of the slow bicycle race. There was usually a fancy dress competition, and in 1926 we see Frank Gardner with Bert Beale holding the baby. In 1921, the events included an open-air whist drive. The large marquee in the background would be full of vegetable and flower exhibits. Fancy dress prize winners in 1921. The main venue for the flower shows was the shearing close, but the park may have been used on one or two occasions. The comic football teams in 1924, with one of the recently built council houses in the background. The dog show in 1922. In 1932, a fine tree in the cheering close provides shade for the band. In the background is the old thatched barn on the Bourne side of the field. Mr. and Mrs. Clarkson, with their staff, and the Reverend Freeman, outside the old school about 1908. When the new infant school opened in 1900, this allowed for the education of around 300 children. In 1883, there were 2 Sunday schools attended by over 200 children. This is about 1921, with Mr. Clarkson, headmaster, and his wife, headmistress of the infants. In the back row, probably Violet Veal, Maud Stratford, Mr. Wyatt, and Lucy Veal. Mr. Clarkson was headmaster for 36 years, the longest on record. In 1873, the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Society gave a concert in the school. Another early view of teachers. In 1867, Mr. Etchells, who had been headmaster of Hook Norton School for 15 years, was forced to resign because he would not conform to the high church teachings of the Reverend Cox, the new rector. A group outside the infant school. The Reverend Freeman took a great interest in the school and paid regular visits. In 1872, out of 150 pupils, 110 were away with measles. Another group of slightly older children. At the annual meeting of school managers on May the 22nd, 1890, there was a discussion and argument as to why there had been 15 different teachers in 9 years. Two teachers and more children outside the infant school. Miss Cross created a record by being a teacher at Hook Norton School for 42 years, from 1924 to 1966. This is a more up-to-date picture of the teachers at the secondary modern school in the 1958 to 59 period. Back row, John Long, Jeff Walton, Joan Lawrence, Bruce Barr. Front row, Rosemary Davis, Betty Cross, Harry Broadbridge, Gerald Bright and Bertha Collins. The secondary modern school opened in 1950 with around 120 to 130 pupils. Mr. Thompson, headmaster, with the Hook Norton Children's Choir on the Chipping Norton Town Hall steps, after winning the Star Choral competition in 1927. In the early part of this century, children were going home for dinner, but later school dinners were provided in the Memorial Hall, prior to the building of the new school. A performance of Aladdin by pupils of Hook Norton Church School in 1929. Hook Norton Troop of Boy Scouts, but the site is unknown. It appears to be in the First World War period. During the Second World War, there were a large number of evacuee children in the village, causing education and accommodation problems. The Heathrop Meet outside the Red Lion in 1929. The cottage next to the Red Lion, which was burnt down in 1945, can be seen here. A large gathering of spectators in front of the churchyard wall on the same day. And again in 1928 outside the general store, which was probably kept by Reuben Green at this time. Watching another meet around the same time. In 1926, J. Jackson, C. Hewitt and Mr. Knight bought 3/4 of an acre at the top of Queen Street to construct a building for electrical equipment and a bungalow for a resident electrician. Here we see Charlie Hewitt and the building being demolished. Completed building with Hook Norton electricity supply in the apex. In 1927, the first 3 customers were R. Green, F. Phipps and Mr. Colgrave. Wiring was done by Charlie Hewitt, and W. Weston, the blacksmith, made the metal brackets to carry the overhead cables. This was the diesel engine supplied by Fielding and Platt of Gloucester, which drove the dynamo, charging up to 140 batteries to an average of 240 volts DC, which supplied the 40-watt bulbs in the village. This engine weighed 10 tons and had a 10-foot diameter flywheel. By 1935, the Shropshire, Worcestershire and Staffordshire Company were taking over. From Bell's Lane, we looked down to what was the asylum yard, which had 2 large wooden doors at the entrance. In the early part of the last century, over 100 patients, some in a dangerous condition, were housed here. When the county asylum was built, these premises were closed in 1854, and the building in the centre was converted to 6 cottages. Around 1960, these cottages were demolished and a new council development took place. Gingerbread Cottage remains in the background and is dated 1625. Some of the asylum cottages that were condemned and demolished after being inhabited for villagers for many years. Looking up from Down End towards High Street, we see the tight and 5 or 6 thatched dwellings. The one on the left, with the board over the door, was the home of 2 beer retailers, William Cox in 1895, followed by Nelson Chapman. Higher up the road on the right was J. Hatton, a carpenter and wheelwright, followed in the same trade by J. Robbins. Looking in the opposite direction is the wilderness allotments, now built on, and the viaduct next to the station in the background. Looking back up Bell's Lane, with the cottages on the right, and behind the one at the end of the green that was burnt down in 1929. The fire at Down End on August the 4th, 1911, when 3 thatched cottages were destroyed by fire. The stone from the ruins was used to build Stuart House soon afterwards. At the bottom of Down End, on the left, is the 2-spouted hand pump, and the cemetery, the site of which was bought by the parish council in 1898 for £147 10 shillings. Well Close was in the corner of this plot, and the site of the first chapel, from 1829 to around 1885, when the stone was used to build the new one in Chapel Street. In the earlier part of this century, the metal cemetery gates were kept locked, with keys available to those who needed to attend graves. The top cemetery was consecrated on August the 3rd, 1941. The 2 cottages at the bottom of Park Hill that were demolished to make way for new development. Prue's Close on the right, where 2 bungalows now stand, was owned by the parish council and used for a short while as a children's play area before the equipment was moved to the shearing close. The parish council sold this plot of 1.3 acres for £1,200. A view from the park looking into the bottom cemetery, with the wilderness allotments on the other side of Tite Lane, the cottages that were burnt down, and just below is Harris's timber yard. In the earlier part of this century, his horses and traction engines were bringing in timber carriages loaded with tree trunks to be sawn down in this yard to supply the local wheelwrights and timber merchants. Mr. Harris, on the extreme right, standing by Black Prince in his yard. This engine is now at Bressingham Museum. Mallam's close allotments were behind the timber yard. Looking down Bell Hill, the cottage on the left is the home of Jim and Percy Hacklin, who did boot and shoe repairs between 1931 and 1955. Bridge House at the bottom was a private lunatic asylum from 1725 to 1854. The Miss Dickens and their brother came to live at Bridge House in 1896. This bridge is the oldest in the village and was widened towards Park Lane in the 19th century. From here we see Middle Hill, unrestricted at this time, which was the main route from Southrop to the church and the school. On the right up the hill were J. Tappins and Sons, blacksmiths and carriers from 1871 into this century. Note the white rail-fenced water supply known as a tite. Middle Hill has also been known as Blacksmith's Hill. This dwelling was where George White the undertaker lived, and the small cottage just above has been a surgery in more recent times for Dr. Latcham from Chipping Norton until 1970. On the right, at the bottom of Middle Hill, John Woolgrove started a bakery business about 1864. He was followed by Richard Rolls in 1871, then Woolgrove and Bayliss, and finally C. A. Cox in 1931. On the right-hand side of Bell Hill, Mr. and Mrs. Smith were bakers in the 1890s, followed by James Christmas, who moved to here from Wisteria House and delivered bread over a wide area with 2 smart horse-drawn vans. Just above this dwelling was Mr. Girling, boot and shoe repairer. An early view of the same area, and much of the property thatched at this time. Thomas Pargeter was cleaning, filling and lighting 18 street oil lamps in 1906, but they were usually not lit during the full moon period. A very early view of a water cart on the wooden bridge over the Rop stream. Looking up Bridge Hill across what was once called Blackmore Bridge, the window of the thatched cottage on the left has been boarded up. Another view of Bridge Hill after the end cottage in the last photo has fallen down. On the extreme left is part of Woodbine Cottage, which was bought in 1964 for £540. An outside staircase part way up Berrycroft Road. The children were involved in numerous concerts to raise money for the Red Cross during the First World War time. This is a 1916 photo, but we're not sure where it was taken. Girls lined up for Tommy Atkins in front of the old school. Another one with location unknown. And the same girls in a patriotic display. A pleasant view of the church from the top of Brick Hill. The house facing us went with Fanthill Farm in the earlier part of this century and was occupied by Robert Stearman. To the left is Southrop Farmhouse with a date stone of 1645, and the front of the house has unusual stone mouldings. The house on the right is where Tom Smith ran a butcher's business earlier this century. There is a date stone of 1798 on the end of the house. This shows the two houses behind the footpath to Rope Way, an unusually tall chimney behind, and the oil street lamp in front. Beanacre Cottage, the embankment and viaduct, and the old fleur-de-lis or wheat sheaf. on the left. Standing outside the entrance to the Wheatsheaf are T. Heritage, A. Hazel, Mrs. Hillman and A. Hillman, about 1926. The old thatched cottages in Rope Way that were demolished in the 1960s. Wallingtons were in Rope Way in the 1940s and 50s and delivered firewood on their lorries. Left to right we see Neville Pierce, Gordon Pierce, Terry Atkins and John Hortin. At the entrance to Ashburton Lane we see Buck Woodward and his wife. The three-storey dwelling facing us, by the entrance to the park, was the home of George Somerton, a carrier in the last century. In 1875 there were 3 carriers in Hook Norton, going to Banbury and Chipping Norton several times a week. Carriers in 1907 were John Osborne, Walter Whiten and J. Thomas Bench. Charles Whiten was a carrier with a Ford van in the 1920s. A sow with a litter of pigs at the back of Ashburton House early this century. This black and sandy pig originated in the Hook Norton area during the middle of the last century and became very popular due to their very tasty bacon. Southrop House, which has a date stone of 1707, also has an outside staircase, one of several which are special features in Hook Norton. The large garden at the rear of the house has been the scene of many village events in the past. Hook Norton football team, cup winners, outside the Sun in 1930 with the Reverend Beardshaw. The 4 in the front row are H. Woodward, T. Williams, Harry Heritage and Ralph Padbury. A large gathering of supporters for the cup winners in the 1922-23 season. The football team around 1930. The 1947-48 season was an outstanding one. Hook Norton team winning 3 cups, the Chipping Norton Charity Cup, the Rollright Engineers Cup, and the Chipping Norton League Cup. In the back row are Mr. Painter, Mr. Coppage, J. Tooley, G. White, N. Stratford, J. Padbury, W. Gardner, W. Horn, and Bill Clark. In the centre, T. Adkins, T. Harris, and G. Manley. On the front row, Frank Horn, Ken Smith, T. Wright, A. Page, and Percy Stratford. Cricketers, about 1953. Back row, Charlie Hewitt, Horton Heritage, Gordon White, Aubrey Heritage, Jack Gray, and P. Hearn. Centre, John Goddard, Charlie Hollis, Bill Clark, Harry Heritage, and Colonel Colchester. Front row, Jeff Hillman, Arthur Page, and Ken Smith. From Mobbs Lane we look into Chapel Street. The shop on the right at this time was kept by J. Timms, furniture, fruiterer and seedsman. He was followed by his son Archibald. Mr. Gillett had a chemist's shop here, and J. Dumbleton sold fruit, vegetables, etc. Laurie Heath took over as a shop and a post office in 1978. On the opposite side of the road, in 1895, William Somerton was keeping the Blackbird Inn, which was a Hopcroft and Norris house that closed around 1915. The landlord then had a butcher's shop at Gosling's Cottage. The Wesleyan Chapel was built in 1885 on the site of several cottages, the stone being used from the demolished chapel down Tite Lane. The earliest mention of a Wesleyan congregation in Hook Norton was 1794. The broken windows were some of many damaged in the village by a severe hailstorm on September the 22nd, 1935. The chapel was demolished in 1985 after being in existence for only 100 years. Below the chapel and monkey puzzle tree is the post office, moved from High Street to here in 1924. It was taken over by Mrs. Cox, followed by her daughter Mrs. Heath. It had the first telephone exchange. The letterbox can just be seen in the bottom corner of the window. The house has a date stone of 1676 and the letters P.T.M. This is a Chipping Norton Bowyer Lodge of Freemasons, arriving to lay the foundation stone of the Memorial Hall on May the 20th, 1921. The site was bought from Edward Minchin for £121 16. It had previously been the village pound, which was moved to the horse fair corner of Bourne Lane. Pounds were no longer in use after 1856. The opening ceremony was performed on October the 14th, 1922, by the Earl of Plymouth, arriving here in his Daimler limousine. Here we see the opening ceremony. The committee, with the Earl of Plymouth in the centre. The parish council meetings now moved from the old school to here. There was also a library in the hall, with Miss Dickens as first librarian. The interior of the hall, which was built by Alfred Williams at a total cost of £2,500. A series of free concerts celebrated the opening. 1 month later, November 1922, the Women's Institute was formed. This is the hall, probably in the 1930s, with the hut that was used by John Harris and the Brimbo one just below. In 1928, there was still an outstanding debt of £275 on the hall, which was not finally paid off until October 1932. And in 1930, there were problems with the south wall. May Day, with Winnie Pinfold as Queen, with her attendants. Silver Jubilee celebrations in 1935. Julia Horn, Roger Ainley and Margaret Painter. On June the 16th, 1887, Queen Victoria's Silver Jubilee was celebrated. Church bells rang at 6 a.m. A procession of children to the church for the 11 a.m. service, and a meat tea in the park, with sports all day and a bonfire at night. May Day in 1938 in Wisteria House Garden, when Margaret Painter was the Queen. Maypole children and their decorated horse-drawn Oxfordshire wagon behind, but the location is unknown. An early picture of May Day celebrations in Hook Norton, with the fruit trees in bloom. Dancing round the Maypole in the square in 1938. An early 1890s view of the triangle, and the old surgery in the centre with no house adjoining. The thatch on the dwelling on the left was replaced by tiles in the 1930s. Elijah Gardner, a thatcher, lived in the house on the right at one time. In the 1930s, members of the parish council consistently complained about the dangerous crossroads here. Looking towards the triangle from the Sibford Road. probably a wedding group in about 1900 outside the house on the triangle, which was recently extended by Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The old surgery on the right, where Dr. Routh in the last century and Dr. Mottram in this each held a surgery. They were both from Sibford, from where Hook Norton relied mainly for its doctors. Notice the old oil lamp on the triangle. This shows the porch and front door to long thatch from the footpath, with the iron railings. In the wall, lower down, is a post box that was cleared at 11:40 a.m., 4:35 p.m. and 7 p.m. It was probably removed when the post office moved from High Street to Chapel Street. Early days on the Green. In 1895, H. Coles, a farmer, corn dealer and baker, lived at the end, and his board can be seen over the doorway. Other tradesmen on the Green have included a stonemason, carriage builder, seedsman, newsagent, fruiterer and station master. About 1903, Baker Coles's cottage and probably two others were completely burnt down. This shows the Coles family and others after the fire. In 1903, Alan and Henry George were builders living on the Green. Here they are in the ruins after a fire, which we have been told was in their workshop. Hook Norton won the Best Kept Village competition in 1962. Villagers outside the old school witnessed the presentation of the award. The wedding of Mr. J. Fairbrother and Miss Andrews, about 1923, outside the Railway Hotel. The Andrews were landlords here at this time. Club Day in the Square in 1910. Club days were held on the Tuesday before Whitsun, the club being a local benefit society. A large, smartly dressed crowd watched the riding circus, or ginny horses. In 1869, the Hook Norton Benefit Society were meeting at the Sun Inn. One of the many stalls that would have lined High Street. Club Day in 1911 and numerous flowery hats. A visiting band playing for the occasion. It could have been the Britannia Works Band from Banbury. The Hook Norton Band played in 1912. This gives a good view of the metal arch over the entrance to the churchyard. Club Day and Hook Norton Band with the Bodycut banner behind, and some of their members. Different village clubs often celebrated with each other. Club Day in 1912, with members and the band on the rectory lawn. In this century there was also the Pig Insurance Association, the Benevolent and Sick Society, and the Funeral Fund. Another gathering on the rectory lawn, with the club banner in the centre and members holding their wooden staffs. Hook Norton Agricultural Association was very active in the early part of this century. Here the root crop samples are laid out ready for judging in the square, while the sacks of corn were in the archway of Belled Inn. The ploughing match was held in various fields around the village. The shearing close was the site for judging heavy horses, sheep and pigs. The farm stock and root grain show has also been held behind the Hermitage, now Hayden House in East End. Flick and Lock held farm stock sales in the shearing close early this century. A play, The Confidential Maid, at a Conservative garden party at the Manor. The cast are Harry Baker, Miss Clark, Nancy Hambridge, and one unknown. The pastoral play, Sir Barnaby Bladen, at the Flower Show in 1921. Of Rag Row. The White Gate was an entrance to farmland and buildings, also the Butts. Just above is High Rock. This road has been known as the Horse Fair and Hayden's Lane. The 6 Rag Row thatched cottages were being lived in till the late 1950s. This is a photo of them in the 1960s, shortly to be rebuilt and turned into one dwelling known as Yew Tree Cottage. The entrance to the glebe is on the right. These houses were built on church allotments and completed in 1947. Some of the cottages from the lane side. Milk churns were brought to the end of the lane for collection and can just be seen in the bottom left-hand corner. High Rock was built about the beginning of this century by the George brothers. Fairview above, once the home of Tom Williams. A lady with her handbag and a milk can, and some well-dressed children. Just below Fairview is a wooden hut which was used by Dr. Taylor, then Dr. Agnew, both of Sibford, as a surgery. In later years it was replaced by a porter cabin till around 1970. On the site of the new school we see Harry Hine, Mr. Baker's carter, with a single furrow plough. Above the dwellings opposite is where Hicks's Lodge was built in 1934, on a site that cost only £25. Mr. Hicks employed around 60 men, building houses for the Chipping Norton, Brackley and Shipston-on-Stour rural district councils, and numerous houses in the villages around, including the glebe in Hook Norton. Unfortunately, he died in 1957 at the age of 54. Hook Norton Band was formed in 1888. Prior to this, bands from Banbury, Bloxham and other villages were playing in the village. In 1880, Mr. D. Kay's band was leading the processions. The Hook Norton Wesleyan Mission Band was formed in 1885 and was in existence into the earlier part of this century. The band at the time of John Harris, who is standing by the drummer. He was their conductor at one time, also Chief Fire Officer for 33 years and Clerk to the Parish Council for 50 years. He died in 1955. The band that played for Coronation Day celebrations on May the 12th, 1937. Horace Busby is the bandmaster here. Leading the parade at the flower show in 1922. And in the same year playing at Swerford Club. The band under the tree in the shearing close for the 1929 flower show. The staging supported by beer barrels. Hook Norton Band lead the Armistice Day procession in Bloxham in the 1950s. Armistice Parade from church in Hook Norton about 1960 with ex-servicemen, the fire brigade and Girl Guides. St. Peter's Day Tea in 1925 with the Reverend Beardshaw. This annual event on June the 29th started in 1891 and ended in 1946. St. Peter's Day in 1921. Teas were usually served in the rectory garden, but a picnic in the park has been known to take place instead. A group of all ages in 1925. At the 1923 event, with the Reverend Freeman in his customary straw boater. After a fire at Hook Norton on August the 4th, 1911. Decorated for the Jubilee of 1935 with the trailer pump that was bought in 1930 for £435. Until the Second World War, the brigade was under the authority of the parish council. Afterwards, the county council took charge. In the shearing close with the trailer pump are standing C. Cox, F. Whiten, J. Radbourne, W. Clark, H. Borsbury, E. Marshall, G. Horn and E. Hayne. Seated are E. Phipps, F. Hopkins and E. Turnock. The horse-drawn Merryweather fire pump in the shearing close for the flower show. At this time, horses had to be found from the coal merchant, the carriers or the bakers before the fire brigade could move off. The new fire station was opened in 1953. A rick fire on August the 5th, 1911. Hay ricks often overheated in those days, and could set themselves alight. The Hook Norton Choral Society, on the steps of the Town Hall at Chipping Norton in 1912, with their conductor, Miss Margaret Dickens, after a competition against choirs from over a large area. The Women's Institute Choir at the St Pancras Hall Choral Society competition, with Mr Cunningham, their choir master, in 1950. In the late 1930s, younger men of Hook Norton formed a branch of the St John's Ambulance Brigade, which was affiliated to the Banbury Division, and are seen here on parade. This is probably the opening ceremony of their hut at the top of Queen Street. The Reverend Nind making a speech, with Mrs Crossman, their president, and Mr Coppage, who, apart from being the station master, was also church warden from 1926 till he died in 1960. Members pose for a photo outside the hut. And the interior of the hut, which was used for talks and demonstrations. When St John's came to an end, it was taken over for band practice. It was the custom for the procession at most celebrations to start at Hollybush Corner. This is a small part of one, about to pass Hayden House for the Silver Jubilee of 1935. In 1929, the parish council was asking for white lines on the village corners. On the right we see Hayden House, probably occupied by James Harris at this time, before he moved near to his timber business in Down End. After he left, his son John lived here. In addition to the 2-acre plot behind the dwelling was a small paddock. The heavy horses for the timber wagons were housed here, and their stables with large wooden partitions still remain here. A building here was used for a short time as a primitive Methodist chapel, and the building nearest this way is thatched here. Part of Arley House on the right with a thatched roof. Between this house and Salford's is a stone wall with a garden behind. In 1875, William Luckett lived in a house here. He was a carrier, carpenter and coal merchant. East End farmhouse with its railings in front. The lane adjoining led to the workhouse, where there were 24 inmates in 1814. It closed in 1836, when the Banbury workhouse was opened, and it was converted to 9 cottages. The house on the right was occupied by Alfred Williams. He was a builder, coal merchant and undertaker employing around 40 men and boys. Behind this dwelling was a large plot of land which he used as a timber yard. The neatly thatched cottage adjoining belonged to the Brimbo Ironstone Company early this century. The front door has now been moved to an extension to the left. Note the de-restriction sign on the triangle. Surely an odd place to put it, just before a sharp bend. An old view from Hollybush Corner, showing the milk delivery from the churn on wheels and East End farmhouse before the castellation, porch and bay windows were added. On the right, the entrance from the pavement to one of the 6 thatched cottages which were demolished in the early 1950s. The site is now occupied by 2 bungalows, one with a date stone of 1956 and WTH. During the Silver Jubilee celebrations, Miss Dickens plants a tree along the station road. An 1890s view of Hook Norton Station. The wagons on the left would have been brought from Austin's Way loaded with ironstone. The station opened on April 6, 1887, with no special ceremony, and there were 4 trains each way from Banbury to Kingham. An early view of the entrance to the station. On the right, a branch line with loaded wagons, and behind them the waiting room and the first signal box on the up line. The passenger service closed on June the 4th, 1951, and the goods on November the 4th, 1968. A closer view of the first signal box. John Harris, an insurance agent, had it erected next to the Memorial Hall for use as his office, when a new one was built on the other side of the line. In the 1890s, the journey from here to Birmingham took 2 hours 14 minutes. A later view showing the new signal box on the Banbury side of the main building. The metal bridge over the Banbury Road can just be seen on the left. Squire Faulkner had the Railway Hotel built at the turn of the century, and shortly afterwards it was sold to the Hook Norton Brewery Company. A later view showing the goods shed and the coal trucks on the left, and on the right a large heap of stone that was needed to reinforce the track. The Swansea and Cardiff to Newcastle Express. It only stopped very rarely, at special request and with several days' notice. The time was 12:18 p.m. and the one in the opposite direction at 4 minutes past 4. The first express ran in 1907 on 6 days a week, but this service was not restored after the Second World War. The Earl of Dudley ironstone works was situated on the east side of the main viaduct, and only in operation from 1901 to 1916. The single kiln was filled at the ratio of 500 weight of coal to a ton of ironstone, then fired. This shows the branch line that supplied the coal for the kiln and brought out the fired ironstone to be delivered to the Round Oak Works at Selly Oak. A cable system moved the stone and coal between the branch line and the kiln, with Southrop and the village in the background. From the east side, the Dudley kiln and the main viaduct. Underneath the girderwork was a catwalk from where the permanent way ganger made a daily inspection of the track. Trap doors either side of a pillar allowed him to proceed along the viaduct. The width of the top of the pillar was 10 feet, and the girderwork rested on rollers with a gap to allow for expansion. The viaducts were tested periodically on a Sunday morning. 2 engines came out from Banbury and were coupled together near the tunnel. Scaffolding was erected, as seen here, so that any movement in the ironwork could be detected. At a given signal, the 2 engines, together weighing around 200 tons, proceeded over the viaduct at 40 miles an hour. A view along the top of the viaduct showing a guardrail to prevent derailment. The express on the viaduct in 1908, making its way towards Chipping Norton and Kingham. This shows more clearly the catwalk and the Dudley Works. The building of the massive pillars with the help of a steam-powered derrick to raise the stones. At this time, many villagers were making money boarding the workers and hiring out horses. Demolition of the girderwork in 1965. In 1966 it was considered by some that the remaining pillars were an eyesore. A letter from British Rail stated that the pillars were in such good condition that to demolish them and clear away the stone was an expense they could not afford. Luckily, they are still being preserved. So much effort that served a purpose for so short a time. This site and further land was bought by the Hook Norton Ironstone Company, and the first of these two kilns was working between 1896 and 1900. A steam-operated lift took the stone to the top of the kilns. The First World War brought extra demand, and two more kilns were added, one on either side. They were about 65 feet high and connected by a 2-foot gauge track. A rotary tipper at each kiln conveyed the stone from the trams to the kilns. Very briefly, the purpose of the kiln was to dry out the moisture, clean the stone, and create around 28% loss in weight. Loaded trams about to leave for the kilns. Explosives were used to loosen the stone, which was usually around 14 feet deep. In 1915, men got 4p. halfpenny for filling a tram, with about 2,500 hundredweight of stone. Trams being loaded in the park farmland. The topsoil was wheeled by hand across the plank to the worked-out area. A closer view of this operation. By 1926, calcining was coming to an end, the stone being transferred directly into railway wagons. The steam navvy, bought in 1915 and seen here at Park Farm. The grader and riddler is behind. It was mounted on rails and moved along by horse. A Wilson's Showman's engine was bought to go with it to provide the electric light. This allowed the equipment to work in the dark during the First World War period. Men standing in front of the riddler, which helped to remove soil from the stone, which it conveyed to empty trams situated on a line alongside. This equipment was needed to supply the big demand at this time. The engine Joan, with trams near the lift. The boiler on the left supplied power for the lift. Behind the engine is the gas supply, with rails round the top. Electricity was made here to light the area and allow a 24-hour day to be worked. By 1946, all the ironstone workings had completely finished. Mrs. Mobley, with a converted shooting brake that came from Scotland. With her husband George, she was a carrier to Banbury in the 1930s. This photo was taken in the centre of Bloxham. Osney Mill, at the end of the last century. It is situated on the parish boundary with Swerford and described as the mill of Hook Norton that is by Swerford. The lord of the manor of Swerford claimed his right to the mill, which caused much dispute. A lady stands on the footbridge over the ford of the River Swere. The extensive buildings behind eventually became little used, and by the 1930s were being demolished, and the stone used to build a dwelling just above. Charlie Hall, standing by the engine, with his thrashing tackle, which was moved around local farms by teams of horses to thrash the corn from the ricks. The charge for a day's thrashing in the 1920s was £5 for the equipment and 2 men. 7 or 8 more men would have been needed. Oscar Hall of Bacon Farm entertains the thrashing gang at dinner time. He had a wooden leg, but was capable of walking behind a single furrow plough and 2 horses all day. Stosh White, a Hook Norton pig killer, shows Oscar how to dress pigs at Bacon Farm. Oscar's wife and daughter stand by their horse-drawn trap, ready to take their harvest festival decorations to Hook Norton Church. Situated between the Gate Hangs High and the Wigginton Crossroads was the old lodge farmhouse, built to an L plan, with a date stone of 1646. It was occupied till around 1950, but considered unsafe in the late 60s and demolished. It had also been known as the Fox and Hounds Public House. In 1890, a licence was granted, after 2 years without one. At one time, it was used by drovers on their way to Banbury Market. There was a pound nearby in which to leave their animals. Nil Farmhouse, dated 1777, was also known as Rectory Farm. This dovecot in the farmyard suggests that it was a manor or religious house at one time. The room below was known as the men's room. In the farm buildings are the remains of 2 threshing floors. In 1871, Nil Farm was 562 acres and employed 16 men and 5 boys. This is Frederick Pinfold, landlord of the Gate Hangs High in the 1920s. He spent much of his time rabbiting, which explains the ferrets on his shoulders. His small number of farm animals could be seen grazing the local roadside verges in the summer. This is his wife at the entrance with Olive and Ivy. Hook Norton Brewery took over the inn around 1900. This was another resting place for drovers. There were gates across the road to retain their animals, which were not necessary later. Hence, this gate hangs high and hinders none. In front of the gate are Mrs. Pinfold and family in a pony trap, with an old car to the left. In 1518, William Scott owned land in this area, and it is said that the gate area was known as Scott's Lodge. Off the Banbury Road is Manor Farm, previously known as Lampett's Farm. It was church property till the 19th century. On the house is a date stone of 1791. Of the 41 farms listed in 1873, only 4 were over 100 acres. At Park Farm in the 1930s, we see William Page on the binder and his son Arthur on the leading horse. This car was said to have run into a heap of road mending stone by the Brimbo cottages. The driver survived. To end our film, we would like to say thank you to all who have helped with their memories. Having been round most of the village of the past, we return to Hollybush Corner, from where many processions into the village started, and wonder what a similar procession in the future would reveal.